Now, what do you want, an educational project or a litany of excuses? I don't want some amorphous series detailing society's ills. If you leave everything in, soon you've got nothing.
Season 5 is the final season of the show, and in contrast to the previous seasons, which each had 12 or 13 episodes, Season 5 only has 10. We'll talk about the reasons for that and what effect it had on the show later. The season has a new focus on journalism, adding the Baltimore Sun paper as a prominent part of the plot. David Simon, of course, was a journalist before his television career, and this season particularly resonates with his experience. We also get another theme song, of course, this time sung by Steve Earle, who plays Waylon on the show. The song this time has a very Law and Order feel to it. I don't know the exact musical terms, but it really reminds me of Law and Order when I hear it.
When you walk through the garden.
Now, that may very well be intentional, given some of the connections to the show this season. But regardless, this is my least favorite version of the song. Season 5 opens with the homicide detectives tricking a suspect into confessing, based on a false polygraph test. The themes of truth and what we collectively believe is an important theme for the season. Afterwards, we deal with the aftermath of the school's deficit last season. After Carcetti declined the governor's money, they have nothing to pay their police officers with, and their overtime pay is deferred and all other resources being sent to prop up the schools. Morale among police is at rock bottom. This affects the Major Crimes Unit, who have been watching Marlowe day and night to no avail. The unit is disbanded as the city cannot continue to fund a prolonged investigation like that. McNulty takes it particularly hard, slipping back into his drinking and whoring ways without a target to chase. Meanwhile, the Baltimore Sun is also facing cutbacks. As the internet makes newspapers less and less relevant, the Sun has to cut more of its resources to stay profitable for the bosses. This includes layoff for many veteran journalists. Like the city and the police, they demand that their journalists do more with less. One of the journalists, Scott Templeton, is unhappy with the slump his career is in and is unwilling to do the hard work of real journalism. He starts to make up stories which read great but are not true. Editor Gus Haynes is suspicious of Scott's incredible stories, but the bosses are pleased with the sensationalism and support him. Meanwhile, Marlowe, now free from police monitoring, begins his move. He sends Chris to find info about the Greeks from the Port case back in Season 2. There's a great detail that Prop Joe was the one that taught him that police reports are public record after a case, showing that Marlowe is learning and growing himself. He tries to make contact with Sergei in prison, but has to go through Avon to make the deal, who's serving his sentence from Season 3 in Jessup. After being connected with the Greeks, Marlowe tries to offer them money as a gift, but they reject it, as they only want to work with Joe. However, Marlowe continues to push, getting them to agree to keep him as backup in case something happens with Joe. With the Greeks' blessing, Marlowe moves against Joe. He bribes Cheese to his side, offering him his uncle's territory. They ambush Joe at his house. Joe reminds Marlowe that he was good to him, but Marlowe doesn't care as it's just in his nature. Chris then shoots Joe in the head. With Joe out of the way, Marlowe secures control of the Greek connection. He then disbands the co-op, claiming the entire Baltimore market for himself. Meanwhile, McNulty, unwilling to let Marlowe go, comes up with a plan to get funding for the investigation. He begins faking a serial killer in Baltimore, making the natural deaths of homeless men look like murders. His plan is to funnel the money from the serial killer investigation to the Major Crimes Unit. However, because the victims are homeless men, no one cares that they're being killed. Bunk, disgusted at McNulty's plan, has Lester try and convince him to stop. However, Lester actually goes along with it and suggests that they make the serial killer more sensational so that the media can't ignore it any longer. They then start to make the killer look like he's biting the victims as part of a sexual act. This finally gets them some publicity, but the department only gives them 2 detectives, as they still don't want to spend any money. Meanwhile, Michael Lee is continuing as a soldier for Marlo and Chris. Though he has proven he can kill, he questions some of his orders and the reason why they need to kill so many people. Snoop and Chris warn him that he's not supposed to ask questions, but simply follow orders. Dookie, who lives with Michael, is also struggling to find his own place in the world, as he does not fit in a corner or in the legitimate world. Back at City Hall, Carcetti is furious when Burrell brings him Juke's stats. He finally moves to have him fired, making several concessions to the ministers for their support. When Nerys tells Burrell about this, he threatens to expose Daniels' previous corruption in the Eastern. However, Nerys promises him a high-paying job for going quietly. She does, however, take Daniels' file for herself. With Burrell fired, Rawls is placed as acting commissioner, with the intent to replace him in 6 months with Daniels. Meanwhile, Marlo, still wanting revenge against Omar for the robbery last season, has Chris and Snoop torture and kill Butchie in order to draw Omar out. Though Omar is now living in another country, he returns when he learns about Butchie's death. With Marlo in hiding, Omar plans to go after his men to force him out. He tries to ambush Monk in his apartment, but they're waiting for him and fire back. Omar manages to escape by jumping out of a window, but is wounded in the process. Marlo also begins laundering his money, using Levy as his lawyer. He gives Levy his cell number. However, Herc, who's working for Levy, after being fired from the police, steals the number and gives it to the cops. With his cell number, McNulty and Freeman decide to set up a fake wiretap on their serial killer, but in reality, be using it to listen to Marlo. They catch a break when Scott Templeton fakes a call from the serial killer in order to boost his journalism career. McNulty goes along with it, and they get a wiretap up. However, there's a problem, as Marlo doesn't use his phone for normal calls, but only sending pictures. Their wiretap has no way of intercepting those kind of messages. In order to get a machine that can capture pictures, they decide to make their serial killer kidnap his victims and send pictures to the press. McNulty takes a crazy homeless man to a shelter out of state, pretending that he's the killer's next victim. Carcetti decides to take up the homelessness issue for his governor campaign, and promises to devote all the resources necessary to catch the killer. This gets the department to really start spending money. However, the problem is that they're given more men than they actually need. Instead, McNulty starts having them work their actual case and paying for it out of his fake case. Meanwhile, Bubbles, sober after the incident with Sherrod, struggles with sobriety and the guilt he feels over the boy's death. He's living with his sister again, but she refuses to allow him upstairs after the many times he's stolen from her. He's eventually approached by another reporter, Fletcher, who wants to write a story about his experience as an addict. Bubbles is hesitant to share his story with the world, particularly about Sherrod. However, his sponsor Waylon encourages him to talk about the trauma and move past it, and eventually Bubbles works up the courage to share his story with the group. While all this is going on, Bond is pursuing a criminal case against Clay Davis for corruption. He wants to personally convict Clay so that he can use him as a trophy for his upcoming mayoral campaign. However, this backfires when Clay manages to appear sympathetic to a jury, who acquit him despite the overwhelming evidence against him. Meanwhile, Omar, though wounded and limping, continues his crusade against Marlo. He hits several of Marlo's stashes and even kills Savino, who's working as muscle for Marlo. All the while, he puts word out to the community, calling Marlo out. However, one day, he's randomly killed by Kennard of all people, who shoots him in the head while he isn't looking. Thus, the story of Omar is cut tragically short. However, information on Omar's body, along with the wiretap, allows Freeman to crack Marlo's code. They discover the location of the drug supply and manage to arrest all the key players in the organization, including Marlo. However, Levi suspects that given all the information the police have, they must have been running an illegal wiretap. Meanwhile, with the Stanfield case down, McNulty plans on letting the serial killer play out until it's forgotten. However, Kima, whom he told the truth to, can't accept the lie. She tells Daniels, who along with Perlman, do some digging and discover the truth about the wiretap. In jail, Marlowe and his crew discuss who could be the snitch. Monk suggests Michael, citing his unhappiness with the way they've been operating. When Marlowe learns that Omar called him out by name and no one told him, he's furious and demands that they put word out on the street that he's willing to step to anyone. He also says to get rid of Michael on the off chance that he's the snitch. Snoop then tells Michael that they're going out on a job. However, Michael, sensing something's off, gets there early and realizes that Snoop means to kill him. He gets a drop on her first, demanding to know why they want to kill him. She says that his questions and his inability to just follow orders mean that he was never one of them. He then kills her and escapes with Bug and Duke. He drops Bug off at their aunt's house and drops Duke off with addicts that he's been working with. They then go on their separate ways, knowing that this will likely be the last time that they ever see each other again. Now, that's everything I'm going to cover for Season 5 right now. Just like I did for the pilot episode, I'm going to be covering the final episode of the series in the next section. But for now, I want to talk about the season as a whole. The first thing you'll notice is that this season only has 10 episodes. I haven't found an official answer for why, but I suspect it's the usual HBO fuckery. They're notorious for canceling shows prematurely or giving them less resources for their final season, like they did with Rome and Boardwalk Empire. But I believe the fact that this season has 3 less episodes than it should is the main reason why this season has not been well received. The main complaints I've seen about this season are usually about the newspaper and serial killer storylines. The fake killer story is goofy and off-tone for some people, and the newspaper storyline just doesn't integrate with the rest of the season like the schools did in Season 4. I definitely agree with these criticisms. The newsroom characters are just not as fleshed out when compared to the kids from the previous season. For example, can you tell me anything about Alma, Zorsky, or Fletcher, aside from the fact that they're reporters? It makes it hard to care about how Templeton and Whiting are ruining the newspaper when we aren't invested in any of the people who live in that world. However, I feel like this season had the potential to be one of the best seasons of the show. The focus on the media and what the public responds to in a story serves as a meta-commentary on the show itself. Like there's a scene where Dookie is watching Dexter, which is a much more sensationalized show about a serial killer. Regardless of whether you like Dexter or not, it's clear that this is meant to be a statement about how people like shows with exciting premises over realistic ones like The Wire. Imagine if we had gotten 3 or even 4 more episodes. We could have tied the newsroom more directly with the events of the season. We could have seen how the media affects people's perceptions, and that could have had a real impact on how the events of the show play out. Just as the previous seasons showed us the dysfunction in our bureaucracies and everyday lives, this season could have been a meta warning about the shows and media we consume, and a lesson about why truth, even in storytelling, matters more than anything. It would have been the perfect way to end one of the greatest series of television ever made. But as it stands right now, the newspaper just seems to be an occasional distraction, or a tool for the police or city hall to use for their benefit. We also have to address the fact that the newsroom storyline is basically revenge fanfiction for David Simon. Simon was of course a journalist before making the leap into novels and television, and this season reflects his unhappiness with the newspaper industry, in the same way Season 4 reflected Ed Burns' experience with the dysfunctional school system. Scott Templeton was based on a real reporter, Jim Hayner, who Simon believed falsified stories and was protected by editors who wanted him to win a Pulitzer. The editors were John Carroll and William Marimo. You'll recognize that second name as Simon named the asshole Lieutenant Marimo after him. Simon has stated that his entire career has been at least partially motivated by revenge against these bosses whom he blamed for ruining the Sun. If you've seen David Simon getting into arguments on Twitter with literal nobodies, you'll know he really is that petty. The fact that Simon was so close to the material presented here is probably at least partially why the season turned out the way it did. These reporters aren't written to be engaging characters. They're there to highlight all the things David Simon hated about his job. And while that's been part of all the seasons we've seen, Simon may have lost some of his creative objectivity when it came to this season. Even Ed Burns has stated that he wished they had taken the season in a different direction than they did. But that's all I have to say about the season as a whole. Now let's wrap up the story and take a look at the final episode of the series.